Today I want to introduce you to 3 important terms that we will be using over the course of the semester, and we're going to be applying these concepts to fairy tales as a way to show how these concepts can help us better analyze and understand any text that you encounter. After reading Perennially Popular by Pauline Dwan, you should have a general understanding of where fairy tales come from, and why modern versions are so different than their originals. Even if you're not a big fan of fairy tales, it makes for an interesting example of how big an impact the audience can have on a text. Before we start looking at the stories, let's define our terms. So today we're going to be looking at audience, connotation, and message. The audience is the intended group of people that are meant to receive the message. This doesn't always mean that these are the only people that are going to interact with the text, but knowing the intended audience can help us better understand the purpose of the text. Connotation is a feeling or meaning that a word or idea invokes in addition to its literal or primary meaning. Often colors can have different connotations, like red being the color of danger. Other times characters can have connotations, like wolves in fairy tales almost always being untrustworthy and threatening. Message is the point, moral, or meaning of a text. Every text is created by a person, and that person is creating the text for a reason. Understanding that reason is necessary for understanding the text as a whole. All these terms are an important part of critical analysis. In English class, we often use the term criticism to describe any way of taking a closer look at something. Being critical means conditioning the mind to suspect and question the form and function of everything that it encounters, whether it's an essay, article, movie, advertisement, or a children's story. Being critical is not about finding things that are wrong. It means being aware and recognizing that everything has a function, whether we're looking at the lyrics of a popular song or a 300-year-old fairy tale. To help you better understand these concepts, I'm going to be applying critical analysis to a fairy tale that most of you are familiar with. We'll be looking at both the modern version written for children and the classic version written for young adults. In the children's version of this story, our hero is a mermaid who wants to live on land and leave the world that she was born into. While she faces many challenges along the way, in the end, she is rewarded for her actions. She gets a prince, the approval of her family, and lives happily ever after on land. In the classic version of the story, the premise is the same. Our hero is a mermaid who wants to live on land and leave the world that she was born into. However, in this version, the transformation from fins to feet is painful, and walking causes the hero constant discomfort. Despite her efforts, the prince marries someone else, and in despair, our hero commits suicide, turning into sea foam and washing away for her rebellion. So what can we learn from these 2 versions of the same story? We already know that the audience is different for these 2 versions, but how does that affect connotation and message? Let's take a look. So for my analysis today, I'm going to start with the children's version of the story, and I'm going to be using the Disney version, which was released in 1989. While that may seem like a long time ago, in terms of human history, it's pretty modern, and the way that we create movies for children hasn't changed all that much. So let's look at connotation. In the story, we have 2 royal families. Both Ariel and Eric are the children of kings, who rule in a monarchy. Both of these characters live very comfortable lives, and neither character seems all that concerned with the politics or the responsibility of trying to rule a kingdom. Even if you didn't grow up with this story yourself, you likely grew up with the general knowledge of princes and princesses. For most modern-day children, especially in the West, the connotation about monarchy is that it is a fantasy that exists far away from their real lives. There is no concern if Ariel or Eric would be good rulers because that isn't the point of the story. In addition, we see Eric as a kind and thoughtful prince. He doesn't want the expensive statue of himself or the elaborate meals. He wants to go out on adventures and take carriage rides, and that is believable in this fantasy world. Because the modern child's connotation of royalty comes from their storybooks and movies, not from actual history, the concept of Eric wanting to rebel against his responsibilities makes sense, at least to a modern audience. Another way that connotation impacts the story is how we see the relationship between Ariel and Eric. Ariel and Eric meet, date, and marry all on their own accord, no one sets them up, and no one's parents grant permission or oversee their time together. In the modern context, this makes perfect sense, but in the time that the story is supposed to be set, this would never happen. Marriage, for much of history, was something that you did for economic and political reasons, not for love. But because the audience is modern-day children, the romance needs to model the types of relationships that they would understand and be able to follow. On a similar note, we have Ariel and her father. Now, Ariel's relationship with her dad is certainly rocky, and of all the characters in this film, he is probably the most historically accurate in terms of how people actually functioned in the early 1800s. If the story is taking place in the 1800s, the idea of King Triton being bossy and overbearing to his daughter is completely appropriate, considering how power functioned within families for most of human history. However, because this is a film for modern children, the connotation of his actions are negative, and in response, her decision to rebel is completely rational and fair. I could probably go on for a while more with all the different connotations we see about class, power, and even gender roles, but I think you get the idea. Depending on the audience, the connotations of the behaviors and relationships of our characters is going to be completely different. Finally, let's talk about the message of the children's story. In the end, Eric and Ariel end up together, and the parents accept their love, and they get to live happily ever after. The message is that Ariel's rebellion leads to her getting what she wants. The fact that she wants to leave her family and status and seek out a new life is seen as something that makes her likable. After all, modern kids live in a world where childhood is a time to explore and dream. They are told they can be anything they want when they grow up, and so Ariel's actions make sense. Now, let's look at the other version of this story, the one with the pain and the heartbreak and the untimely death of our hero. What can we learn from this story? The first thing we learn is that when we change the audience, the connotations also change. Remember when we said that kids look at the monarchy as a fun fantasy? Well, for adults living in the early 1800s, the monarchy was real and powerful and often dangerous. Remember that this was a time of the Napoleonic Wars, colonialism, and the slave trade, and when no respectable woman would ever leave the house without a hat and bonnet. Therefore, the connotation that we have of Ariel's actions of falling in love with a man who is so different from her, of wanting more than what she was born into, and wishing to seek out a life against the approval of her family, is seen in a much more negative light. Adults in the 1800s weren't allowed to seek out a life that wasn't the one they were born into, especially young women. It was not only considered selfish and disrespectful, but also a moral failure, and it would impact the reputation of the entire family. If you look at the story in this context, it makes sense that the story ends the way it does. The message is that people who are selfish and disrespectful and bold will be punished. While a modern reading of the classic version of the story might paint the prince as a villain for marrying someone else, in reality, the prince was doing what was expected of him. He married the woman that his parents wanted him to marry, and who would act in a way fitting for her position as the future queen. Our hero ends the story by being reminded of her place, and this was an important message for young adults who needed to maintain the status quo and ensure the success of their families. So now that I've given you my analysis of The Little Mermaid, I want you to choose your own fairy tale to analyze. I'm going to have you make a video where you compare and analyze the audience, connotation, and message for two versions of the same story. I have provided a list here of different stories to consider for this assignment. You may also choose a story that isn't included on the list, but make sure there are two distinct versions that are written for different audiences.